The title of my presentation today, of my lecture, comes from the dissertation title of my work. It's of Poets and Physicians, Literature and Medical Thought in 13th Century Italy. More and more often lately, I have been pondering a few notes that I received over the course of my dissertation writing stage. Whether because the particular historical position we all find ourselves in, or because a broader epistemological reason, the big why questions sit heavily upon my work. I dedicated a good deal of my graduate studies to the interconnections between medieval medicine and Italian poetry of the 13th century, and some of the recurrent feedback I got can be summarized in the question, why does this all matter? And by this, I mean the nature of my research itself. A few weeks ago, I retrieved the initial feedback that I received on my dissertation. I believe the year was 2016, and after a very productive workshop on a very first draft of my very first chapter, I realized I got one of the most important lessons of my career. Not only I realized the importance of always aiming for clarity, at the expenses of elitism and elegance, con buona pace di contini, one of my philological heroes since I was at my Sapienza years. But first and foremost, the importance of always addressing the deeper reasons of my work, to tell the how and why of the research at hand. In my case, how and why 13th century poets would experience any attraction for the philosophical arguments of Aristotelian and Galenic natural philosophy. What was there to gain for them? In sum, it was the nature of my whole project that needed to go under scrutiny. I won't say that I firmly reached an answer yet, but still, these questions have been nurturing my work more and more since. Especially now that I'm drafting a book project from these very notes, I wonder if, besides the issues of intertextuality and intellectual history that I initially unveiled in my dissertation, there is a reason why we should consider the medical nature of such a poetry. Many scholars have already studied the medical underpinning of 13th century Italian literature, the likes of Nardi, Corti, Ardizzone, Gentili, Tonelli, Ureni, Gubbini, and the connections between vernacular culture and philosophical background, as done by Barolini, Segre, Folena, Cornish, Kumar, Zavattero, Grevin. While I situate my work firmly in these steps, I try to communicate more with historians of medicine to better understand the interdisciplinary nature of my research. The interconnections between disciplinary fields will always nurture my work, which is essentially, and I never forget it, literary history. Why literature, though? Because I don't believe that the literary imagination is something utterly detached from its historical context, as it were a sort of hyperuranion where images and tropes live outside and before the living minds of those creating them. In my revised introduction, I wrote that my intention was to investigate the tropes of 13th century poets and take them, quote, seriously. And I'm putting from that those pages on my dissertation, not as chimeras of a literary mind, but actual intellectual references that nurture the poetic fibers of our authors and that teach us a different way of looking at physiology, the body, and ourselves, end of quote. To take literature seriously means essentially to give credit to the authors at hand, to read them as they express their concepts, as they visualize the world around them. I am often perplexed when scholars think that poets don't know what they say. Why saying it then? What is there to gain? That doesn't mean poets can create ex novo. Poetry is indeed a matter of poiesis, of creation. but an educated balance between fiction and realism seems to me a productive way to follow, even in poetry. As a matter of fact, I feel that despite the efforts of so many literary scholars of the past few decades, who unveil the inherent scientific nature of medieval Italian poetry, some critics still inhabit the aesthetic positions of Benedetto Croce, albeit incorrectly. They often regard these poetical images as extraneous, as non-poetical elements, and these are words by Croce. Although generative of truly poetical tropes, when, quote, taken materially, and of course that is to me seriously, i.e. in their scientific precision, they are rendered, quote, non-poetical by the non-poetical reader, or the non-poetical anymore reader, end of quote. Once poetry has thus been dissipated through the analysis of its material components, historical, scientific, doctrinal, medical, it is then reduced to, quote, document or instrument for practical goals, and thus it ends existing qua poetry. Our concerns are, of course, not the same as Benedetto Croce's, who wrote his Aesthetica in Nuce in 1928, but I'm still amazed by the persistence of such a sentiment that doesn't share in the poetical value and nature of such analysis. The situation is twofold. These images are either used as tropes, and thus they never reach the level of seriousness granted to their original sources, or they are merely used as documents, and therefore they always need a sort of patent of authenticity granted once again by the identification of the source. It is clear that with this methodological framework, it's a lose-lose situation for the literary critic. When we talk about the scientific elements of a poem, we are often forced to demonstrate the seriousness of such elements or to subordinate them to a secondary source. I don't believe that is the only framework possible, and I believe that we should at least grant our literary authors the benefit of the doubt and let these two approaches coexist. Images and tropes can be taken seriously as a way of putting reality down in words. It's a matter of a forma mentis, as Joel Kay discussed in his History of Balance. What I'm proposing today is a couple of notes that I have been revisiting on medicine and medieval poetry in the aim to show why this connection matters and how it can help us look at much beloved authors like Giacomo da Lentini or Guido Guinizelli with a different perspective. I believe that by looking at these poems seriously, whereas Croce doesn't want us to materially, we might be able to grasp how their scientific tropes are not erudite additions to their poetical imagination, nor mere documents of a scientific discourse that is happening beyond their verses, but the very means through which their poetical culture expresses a new dimension of the body, sense perception, naturalism, and representation. I will start with Giacomo da Lentini and his representation of memorial images. Aspects of memory have been at the core of numerous scholarly works in the past few years. An important contribution like those of Mary Caruthers of Lina Bolzoni have already focused on the idea of memory as a mental image and the correlated psychological and physiological process of its recollection, often in an Aristotelian context. When we read Giacomo's poems, we often discuss the trope of the figure painted or engraved in the heart of the poet, and the possible sources of such an image. I think of Nardi or Allegretto for this particular aspect, but recently Tonelli discussed Giacomo's competence in optical theories as well. But is Giacomo a poet or a scientist? Is he underpinning his poems with philosophical concepts, or is he elaborating a theory of sense perception? The question, as I am presenting it, doesn't necessarily hold water. Not only is Giacomo a notary, il notaro, as you see from the rubric in the manuscript Palatino, notaro Giacomo, notary of the imperial administration of Frederick II, but first and foremost, the literary and manuscript tradition immortalizes him as the poetical founder of a vernacular literary tradition. The problem of why thus forces us to pose the question in slightly different terms. Why would a learned member of the court administration engage with physiological treatises of Aristotelian extraction? I will start with a document that might help us enter the cultural habits of this court. The letter In Exsolendis Rege Prefectures Fastigis, ascribed to the reign of Frederick II or his son Manfred, is attributed by part of the manuscript tradition to the epistolary activity of Pierre de la Vigne, the infamous logothera of Frederick, and roughly contemporary to our Giacomo. While both René Gautier and more recently Fulvio delle Donne tend to postpone the letter to the reign of Manfred, the content of the letter still resonates with the input towards learning of both courts. The letter deems, and I'm paraphrasing from the letter, the seasoning of education to be necessary in the elevation of the dignity of regal office, with the intention of providing humanity with the means to exercise power according to its licit limits, and to give strength to the execution of justice. The letter was supposed to accompany a series of new translations from Greek and Arabic to the scholars and teachers of the University of Paris, or Bologna, depending on the attribution, on account of the customary familiarity with learning that is characteristic of the Hohenstaufen court. An interest that is fueled both by the general assumption that, and I quote, every man naturally desires to know, end of quote, and by a personal aptitude to studies of which we are always being in search since our youth. These are both quotations, important quotations from the letter. Although it would be interesting to address what material sources were possibly exchanged between the imperial court and the university masters, as I said at the beginning, I want to focus on the why. And the why is addressed exactly in those two last quotations. The former, a quotation from Aristotle's Metaphysics, and the latter, a statement that explicitly addresses the continuity of learning at the imperial court. We know already that the cultural life at Frederick's court, and especially as it is presented in the epistolary activity of Pierre de la Vigne, is often linked to a desire to demonstrate the superiority of the imperial over the papal court. And I think of the works of Kantorowicz or Haskins. As Fulvio delle Donne recently wrote, the highly educated profile of the whole administration, whether in logical argumentations or Latin rhetoric, is at the service of the political tensions between Pope and Emperor. And I quote, per vincere le battaglie sul piano politico bisognava contrastare il nemico anche sul piano della cultura e dimostrare che la letteratura fiorita nel giardino dell'impero era di una bellezza e di una qualità superiore a quella dell'avversario, the Pope. The attitude toward learning is thus a political instrument and not an occasional one. It is a fundamental project that has its measure in the individual members who contribute to the presentation of the imperial court to the outside world. This aspect is not limited to one letter of uncertain attribution. We know how groundbreaking Frederick's own scientific curiosity sounded, and shockingly by the words of one among his mudslingers, Salimbene of Parma. And if in many lies there is indeed an ounce of truth, we can detect it in Frederick's own words. In De Arte Venandicum Avibus, a treatise on falconry that has indeed encyclopedic claims, Frederick defines himself as the auctor and as, quote, a detective and lover of knowledge, who doesn't shy away from the experiential verification of Aristotle's Libri Naturales when it comes to bird business, also through the questioning of other learned scholars. And learn indeed the scholars offering their knowledge to the court were. If we consider people like the Syrian physician, philosopher, and translator Master Theodore, the Scottish astrologer Michael Scott, translator probably from Aristotle from Arabic, even if disputed, or other scholars with whom the emperor crossed paths during the itineraries of his imperial activity. For instance, the physician William of Salicet, with whom Frederick entertained conversation on medicine and natural philosophy in Pavia, or the mathematician Leonardo Fibonacci, who popularized the use of Indo-Arabic numerals in the Western world and met with Frederick in Pisa. And all these points are discussed and mentioned by Delle Donne in the book that I mentioned before. This rapid excursus aims at stating the obvious and to remember us that the court administration is embedded into the highest spheres of academic learning first and foremost for poetical showmanship. Thus, it would be strange to see a learned member of this court not engaging with the scientific and political interests of his peers. If I may argue, Giacomo and his fellow poets don't need a reason to express a highly concentration of scientific language in their poems. They just need eyes and ears open to what is happening in the very chambers that they inhabit during their professional, day-to-day lives. And whether in vernacular poetry or in Latin prose, the literary contributions are part of this exact environment. Of this cultural engagement, Dante Alighieri himself was not a distracted reader. When in his De Vulgari Eloquentia, he characterizes how the cultural politics of the Hohenstaufen court emanates upon its surroundings through optical reflection. Different words, different instances of the verb pando, where the noble and cultural center of the emperor outstretches, sue forme pandentes, like the communication of angelic intellections of divine matters, pandendas gloriosas eorum conceptiones. And I owe this note through the lexical connection between these two passages to Sonia Gentili in one of her lectures during my Sapienza years. We might then try and reconcile the professional life of these poets, part of a learned entourage whose poetical aim is to show the superiority of the imperial court through their cultural endeavors, with their own production in the vernacular, not as leisure time, but as indeed another instrument of the cultural politics of the court. So notoriously selective in the choice of literary themes, the attention devoted to the identification of physiological issues in the phenomenology of love and the theoretical characterization of these medical problems are two of the main threads that identify the poetry of the Sicilian school. In Giacomo da Lentini's Meravigliosamente, one of his most famous canzoni, we see how the image of the lady is inscribed in the heart of the poet and the mnemonic process that creates such an image. I'm going to quote from the Italian, but you see here the English translation as well. Com'uomo che t'ha in mente in altro esempio, pinge la simile pintura, così bella facceo, che in fra lo core meo porto la tua figura. While Giacomo in this canzone refers to the creative process of the pintura, in another poem, Madonna voi mando, the formative process of the image in the heart is phrased with scientific precision. The poet remembers the joy he had on the day when he first shaped a representation of the beauties of his beloved. In quello giorno, quando ti formai in cera le bellezze d'intorno. On prosodic and syntactical basis, I argue that the cera referenced by Giacomo is not a Gallicism for face, from French ciere, but wax, as in the product of bees. And I propose that Giacomo's lexical and rhetorical choice points toward a scientific milieu of Aristotelian physiology, not too distant from the well-known trends of the very house of Hohenstaufen. The idea of a virgin cognition before sensorial perception is a knot in the study of the functions of the soul that links Aristotle's psychological treatise, De Anima, with his biological and physiological works, namely the series of books De Animalibus and the collections of short treatises Parva Naturalia. All these texts have been translated and copied in the 12th century from Greek, some of them by the same James of Venice, translator of the widely popular Physica by Aristotle, or from Arabic in Averroes' Epitomes, translated probably by the very Michael Scott, and its circulation, besides some sporadic cases, especially in some of the treatises by Parvanaturalia, have been quite widespread. There are thus material reasons to argue that Aristotle's theory of sense perception was known at the imperial court, both in terms of translations and in terms of interest that are present in the choices and questions circulating among its learned members. Aristotle's physiological theory draws an analogy between the process of sense perception and the shaping of the impression of a signet ring in both De Anima and De Memoria and Reminiscentia. In De Anima, Aristotle describes the affection of the sensors by means of the movement exercised by the external object as the figure of a signet ring in malleable wax. In De Memoria, he described the creation of sense images through perception as a picture of some kind, ut figura quaedam, that is impressed and stored in memory as persons do who make an impression with a seal, sicut sigillantes annulis. This picture is also described as a reproduction of lifelike nature, rendered in the Latin of James of Venice as image of some living beings, animalium pictura. In Aristotle's biological theory, the faculty of sense perception is located in the heart of the animal, as it is well known, whose physiological malleability is directly related to the capacity of receiving said impression. If we then return to Giacomo's Meravigliosamente, we see that the focus on the physiological pattern of the mnemonic act is conducted in Aristotelian terms, exactly these ones. The poet compares himself to an artist who draws a figure from life, com'uomo che ten mente in altro esempio pinge la simile pintura. The poet carries the image of the lady in his art as a portrait taken from life. The relationship between the image inscribed in the heart and the external model is one of mimesis. What is carried in the heart is a faithful reproduction of what appears in reality. Painted as you appear, pinta como parete. As I said earlier, Aristotle compares the physiological process that generates an image to be stored in the cardiac memory to the artistic endeavor of a painter who reproduces from life. The animalium pictura, the centrality given to the organ of the heart, is well understood by Giacomo, who locates the mind, conceived as the power that carries on the cognitive faculties of the animal, not in the brain, but in the heart, in true Aristotelian fashion. The reference to the Aristotelian intertext is reinforced in the image of wax, used as a simile to describe the physiology of memory in Madonna Mia. And as Giacomo says, quando ti formai in cera, in wax, le bellezze d'intorno. And I go deeper into all these references in a forthcoming article for Traditio that you see here on the PowerPoint if you're interested to see more how I am analyzing and comparing these passages together. Developed by Giacomo, the elaborate trope of the image engraved into the heart formulates an array of images that are related to the same physiological paradigm described by Aristotle in his natural books. The heart is understood in its material and psychophysiological features, and its functions are understood as the central sensorium of the human body. This characterization seems to emulate and almost mirror the concentration of political power in the hands of the monarch, who administrates and regulates the transmission of its own images. The pandens used by Dante to describe both the Swabian emperor and the angelic intelligences. Much like the heart, the emperor and his own physical disposition are at the core of a well-cognizant body state, in line with what Kantorovich had said on the king's two bodies. And here we can see why, through the study of Giacomo's tropes, the heart is used and represented in its material components under the edges of Aristotelian physiology. Giacomo is seriously participating in a new vernacular presentation of human sensitivity that draws physiology well into the webs of cultural politics. My second notes will connect the imperial court of Frederick to the intricate webs of the Bolognese studium. In 1249, King Heinrich, or Heinz of Sardinia and Gallura, the natural son of Frederick II, found himself captured by the Bolognese at the Battle of Fossalta. Re Enzo, as the Italian chronicles will remember his name, was imprisoned in the newly built annex to the Podesta's palace, the Palatium Novum, which almost immediately took his name from the illustrious tenant, Palazzo Re Enzo, that you can see here is at the very center of Piazza Maggiore in Bologna. And this is a picture. Situated north of Piazza Maggiore, where some of the most important families of the commune had their headquarters, Palazzo Re Enzo was the place where the Swabian noble remained captive for more than 20 years, during which he was able to gather around his charismatic figure some of the most prestigious people active in the city, most of them fellow Ghibellines, like the members of the Lambertazzi family. As reconstructed by Armando Antonelli and Luciano Rossi in recent years, most of the families orbiting around the Lambertazzi clan, such as those of the Odofredi, Guezzi, Fernari, Della Fratta, Accursi, or De Libri, were also close to the university studium by practice, book exchange, or mere location. Another family that is included in this continuous exchange is that of Guido Guinizelli, not only a poet celebrated by Dante and all the Florentine poets of the second half of the century, but also prosecutor and judge appointed to the Bolognese's prisons. The close proximity between Guido and the schools of law in Bologna is fairly straightforward considering his profession. But Guido's peculiar attitude towards poetry connects his poems with some of the most important masters of the Sicilian school, as well by means of science and physiology, especially those like Giacomo da Lentini or Guido delle Colonne that show a penchant for these elements. Already Favati proposed that Guido recuperation of the Sicilian style might be a way to break through the dominant style of Guittone d'Arezzo, another of these important masters of the Sicilian Tuscan school of poetry. And I would also argue that Guido blends an intellectual engagement with contemporary philosophical cultures in Bologna, with a high level of scientific awareness in the poetry of the Sicilians as well. But why showing an interest in medical theories for a poet, judge, who is finding a space in the literary panorama of the second half of the 13th century? In a much-studied tensone between Guido Guinizelli and Bonaggiunta or Bicciani da Lucca, one of the old-school masters of vernacular poetry, the Lucchese, Bonaggiunta, reprimands our Guido of having changed, mutata, the manner of poetry, la maniera, by mocking the same scientific tropes that Contini already detected in Guido's poetry. Aristotelian scholastic language, la forma dell'esser, forza di scrittura, difficulty in dictum, sottiglianza, ispugna, iscura vostra parlatura, and precisely that senno da Bologna, that wisdom from Bologna, which is of course the bookish academic knowledge, but also that university knows in the air attitude, so typical in 13th and 14th century representations of scholars and students in European institutions, who think of themselves better because of their education, like Nicholas the Gallant in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, or the sadistic Rinieri in Boccaccio's own novella, in Day 8. And in the same years, when Guido is professionally and poetically active, the Studium of Bologna sees in his medical schools a rampant new teacher who will change the face of the medical curriculum and redefine the scholastic method of medicine in Bologna. Taddeo Alderotti, the Dux Medicorum of his generation. So here we are in Bologna with an interesting convergence. Re Enzo, the son of Frederick and stepbrother of Manfred, both pivotal sponsors of New Science Translated, and around whom the Sicilian school of poetry found its birthplace. Guido Guinizelli, the renovator of a scientific trend in lyric poetry that will characterize the following decades, and Taddeo Alderotti, the forerunner in the introduction of new medical theories in the Italian faculties of medicine, namely Avicenna and some of the New Galen. I have been studying the medical elements of Guinizelli's poetry, and it seems to me that Guido indeed shows a proximity to some of the interests that Taddeo is investigating in his medical career as well, especially through the reception of Avicenna. I see Guido engaging with a refined understanding of the debates around the principal role of human physiology. I see his desire to go deeper into the phenomenology of love and its non-traditional representation in poetry. I see Guido repurposing canonical scientific images like that of the magnet to illustrate his stringent philosophical arguments. I see a fundamental grasp of a naturalism that has deep medical roots. I will focus my last note on Guido's most famous poem, the Canzone al Cor Gentile, which Luciano Rossi rightfully named the poetic and moral manifesto of the upcoming still novel, and a radical turning point of the love lyric tradition. As Contini already argued, by framing the parallel between love and the noble heart in the Aristotelian language of potency and act, Guinizelli does not limit himself to saying that love is attracted by a noble heart, but he affirms the radical idea that without a noble heart, there is no love. However, as noted by Gianfranco Fioravanti in a recent book on the philosophy in Italy in the Middle Ages, owning some Aristotelian language is not enough to be considered a philosopher, something that probably Buonaggiunta himself would share. Guinizelli's understanding of the concept of cor gentile is indeed charged with doctrinal precision, and I argue that it is coming from the medical discussions happening around him in Bologna. As stated in the first stanza, the mechanism of love and nobility are not dissimilar from those of nature, and a rational nature is the fundamental hypothesis that holds the physiology of the argument. Love always returns to the noble heart in the same way as the bird follows its natural instinct to find a dwelling in the branches of the woods. Readers of the Canzone like Luciano Rossi or Boitani tend to favor a recourse to Boïthius stabilis orbis as an image expressing the indissoluble laws of nature, a sort of permanently inscribed memory that doesn't allow the tame lion to forget the taste of blood, nor the bird the sweet abodes of the forest. A natural returning to what cannot be truly forgotten, a path that Neoplatonically points towards and back to our first origins. But Guinizelli's first simile must be contextualized together with the following lines, to which they are coordinated by the double negative conjunction ne, neither nor, that clarifies how, by the laws of nature, love and the noble heart are created simultaneously, and one cannot exist if the other does not. And I quote, "Ne fe amor antique gentil cor, ne gentil core antique amor natura." To me, it doesn't seem that Guinizelli is arguing for a coming back to a pre-existing natural place of abode. On the contrary, the first simile of the Canzone stresses the importance of a natural coexistence between two parallel terms, as if the woods could not exist without the birds, or vice versa. The image extends beyond its first parallel by recurring to the coexistence of light with the sun, and that of hotness with fire, two rather canonical similes based on scientific tropes. And the same relationship is traced between love and nobility when Guido affirms that prende amore in gentilezza loco, così propriamente, come calore in clarità di fuoco. These are the last three lines of the first stanza. This first cluster of images extends beyond the first stanza into the rest of the Canzone, and substantiates the logical arguments they are proposed, all based on this natural logic that holds the natural world, a concept also expressed in the adunata of the sonnet Madonna mia, quel dicamor consente. The mechanism of love are thus explained with recourse to the powers of the stones and the influence of the stars, and in particular that of the magnet, an image that is tremendously popular in scientific and medical discourse. As the sun predisposes the stone to receive the influence of the corresponding star and become thus preziosa, so nature predisposes the heart to receive the love potency of the lady and become thus truly asletto, pur gentile, superior, pure, noble. The correspondence between the natural refinement of the stone and the process of falling in love is clearly stated in the last line of the second stanza, where Guinizelli writes how the lady acts like the stars above. Donna a guisa di stella, lo, the heart, namora. The lady makes the heart fall in love as the star. I will try to graphically render the terms of the simile in the PowerPoint, and you see the correspondences here between different elements. I believe that the argument proposed by Guinizelli in the second stanza ties up all the scientific points expressed in the opening images of the poem and clarifies the philosophical tenets of the canzone. Why is Guinizelli describing the issue of nobility in these natural terms? As Paolo Borza and Andrea Robiglio have argued, the question of true nobility is not laughing matter for the poetical and political, social, civic discussions in 13th century Italy, fueled especially by the ever-changing administrative factions of the Comune. By discussing who is truly noble, intellectuals and poets are arguing also in favor or against who is detaining ruling power. Guinizelli is indeed immersed in these matters during his professional and personal life in Bologna, where his ties with the most important Ghibellines families of the Lambertazzi parties lies on a daily basis. By selecting natural tenets that propose a physiology of argumentation, Guinizelli is giving his theory of nobility both a patent of scientificity and a rational grounding that transcends factionalism and clan mentality, something that sadly resonates with our political climate as well. Guinizelli's theory of nobility thus parallels the theory on occult property of things, a concept that, as Nicolas Villeparot has recently demonstrated, ties up together unusual kinds of attraction like the void, magnetism, and the so-called theory of forma specifica. The concept of forma specifica is a scientific theory exposed by Avicenna from Galenic principles in pharmacology, aimed at explaining how drugs can have an effect on the human body beyond that of their own complexio. Avicenna thus draws a parallel between certain kinds of pharmacological properties and the occult properties of stones, like the magnet, whose physical attraction cannot be explained with recourse to their elemental nature, i.e. the magnet doesn't attract iron on account of its being cold and dry. The dissemination of this theory goes along with the introduction of Avicenna's canon, the medical encyclopedia that changed the face of medical scholasticism in the second half of the 13th century. While the theory is indeed discussed in authors during the first half of the 13th century, and I'm thinking of the authors that Villeparot has analyzed, Arnoldo Saxus, Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, a decisive full-length elaboration of Avicenna's forma specifica and medical discourse is to be found in Taddeo Alderotti's medical commentaries. And this is not a surprise if, as Nancy Siraisi and Joël Chandelier have already shown, Taddeo is indeed among the first to introduce the study of Avicenna's canon in medical curricula and to use it in his commentaries. Taddeo discusses the forma specifica at least in two places. One in a series of questions in his commentary to the Isagoge Ioannizzi, an introductory work to the study of medicine and one of the tenets of the traditional medical curriculum, And again, in a commentary on the section of Avicenna's canon dedicated specifically to the forma specifica, the quod comeditur endibitur in canon. I will go directly to the point where Taddeo's discussion of the forma specifica and magnetism is most relevant for the passage I was commenting above. And I will focus on the isagogeia anizi, with the caveat that the passages in the quod comeditur are not too far behind. There are very important discussion in the works of Joël Chandelier, Aurélien Robert, and Villeparo, of course, on this forma specifica in Tadalderotti. With forma specifica, the physician explains a particular property of the object that is distinctive to its species and that is added on top of the substantial form of the body. As explained by Taddeo, specific form is called that which acts by means of its specific property. And in some way, it is what gives the object its specific substantial properties, i.e., the thing that it is. Together with the power of single medicinal herbs, the example given by Taddeo is that of the magnet and the iron, as you can see from the quotations here. So to say that the power of attracting iron is to the magnet its magnetness, the thing that makes it what it is in relation to its properties. Following Avicenna, Taddeo discusses how the origin of the specific form depends on two different factors, one being the disposition of the matter, the ratio materiae, and the other being the influence of the giver, the ratio datoris. With ratio materiae and with the authority of Avicenna to back him up, Taddeo means that which predisposes the matter to receive one particular form. As for the complexio that predisposes the body, form that is the perfection, the perfectio of the matter, as acquired by the disposition of the complexio. Taddeo stresses the difference between predisposition and causality, insomuch as the complexio only prepares, disponit, the thing to receive its form, but does not infuse directly the specific form into the thing. The same thing happens to the rational soul of the human being, where the complexio predisposes the body to receive it from God, but does not cause it to be. Okay? And this is a point that will be developed also in the questiones on whether the forma specifica is the same as the substantial form, and if the soul is the forma specifica in the humans. And it seems that the response is not from the commentary quod comeditur. Okay, if not in reason, if not for the union that the soul has with the body. That is what Taddeo is proposing there. The second party involved in the infusion of specific form is the influence of the giver, which Taddeo explains in terms of an external virtue, this virtus exterior, that is responsible for the apprehension of the specific form, which is the virtue of the heavenly bodies, alicuius corporis celestis, or of the constellation, alicuius constellationis. This influence finds the matter aptly predisposes to the reception of the specific form, that is thus called specific on account of being shared by an entire species. And I'm going to just brush through these two passages that I don't have the time to focus on, but in this quotations here, Taddeo Alderotti is elaborating further on the points that I have so far analyzed. Taddeo concludes this solution by affirming that specific form is not caused by either the disposition of the matter or the influence of the stars, but that is a combination of the two factors, one that is able to bring the potentiality hidden in the being of full actuality. The process that brings the full potency of the matter to actuality, thanks also to the influence of the stars above, is limited to that particular kind of species, identifiable by those pertinent qualities. Hence, the stars can cooperate with a process that had already been laid out by nature in her design. The parallel with the magnet brings us directly back to Guinizelli, who affirms that nature predisposes the heart to fall in love with a woman and to become thus truly noble, that is, to express in full actuality the potentiality always already intrinsic to the species of noble hearts. Guinizelli is clear in stating that the virtues of the precious stone and those of the magnet, one that we can now define as their specific forms, come to full actuality thanks to the influence of the stars, only if the matter has been predisposed to the reception of the virtue. The juxtaposition of the lady with the stars tightens the syllogism whereby true nobility is understood as the specific form of the noble heart, an argument that highlights the scientific interests of Guinizelli. True nobility does not pay attention to lineage of ancestry, as the influence of the stars does not care about the disposition of the mud, because nature has not planned it accordingly, and thus the nobilitating powers of the heavenly bodies cannot actualize the virtue that was never there to be in the first place. The undisposed mud is therefore compared to the man who the common people call gentile, but who is not noble at all. Fere lo sol, lo fango tutto il giorno, vile reman, nel sol perde calore. Disoma al ter, gentil per sclatta torno, lui semblo al fango, al sol gentil valore. The nonsensical pride of the man who will never be truly noble because his heart has never been predisposed to receive the virtue of love is comparable to that of the soil which fancies itself a diamond or a topaz. Taddeo discusses also the relationship between complexio, substantial form, and specific form. And Taddeo regards complexio as the habilitating cause, the causa habilitans, for the apprehension of the specific form. And by referring to the Aristotelian doctrine on causality, he understands specific form as the final cause of the complexio, final cause being the thing to which end the object is caused. Taddeo, therefore, uses each of these arguments in order to avoid affirming the dangerous direct relationship between dispositions and qualities deriving from them. Guinizelli's argument about the causal relationship between love and the noble heart is conducted in a similar way. As is stated in the very first lines of the canzone, it is not enough to have a noble heart if there is no lady to fall in love with, because otherwise the true nobility of the human being has no chance to come out in full actuality. Nor is the simple influence of the beloved lady enough to ennoble the heart, because a certain disposition that has been planned by nature needs to be present as well. Love is therefore the final cause of the noble heart, predisposed by nature to receive it from the lady, and created with the intention to become fully actualized by the nobilitating powers of Madonna, or, as Guinizelli would put it, nature did not create love before the noble heart, nor the noble heart before love. And what are then the social repercussions of such a statement? To me, it seems that Guinizelli is arguing for an elitist theory of nobility, one by which the true nobles are not those necessarily in power or those pretending to be noble on account of their ancestry. The species of the true noble humans is thus on a different planet from those just claiming their own nobility. Vili rimangono, they are still vile, while the true nobles will eventually shine like the star, giving them their virtues. In conclusion, it seems to me that there are enough reasons for these authors to look deeper into the medical and scientific discussions that are happening around them. Medicine and natural philosophy are not reservoirs of images to be sapped and passed into poems, but on the contrary, poetry is another form of discussion that engages with concepts that shape the view on the contemporary world. Is then poetry the same as natural philosophy? Of course not. And the fact that these authors are expressing their views in poetic forms, vernacular language, and traditional forms like the canzone or the sonetto is already a relevant choice. But it doesn't imply necessarily that the nature of their argumentation is of inferior quality, and the awareness of their scientific argumentation is there to prove it. Giacomo discusses the nature of the heart and its role in sensorial representation and memory with an eye at both the scientific interests of his boss and his pragmatic role as a ruler. Guido Guinizelli frames his theory of nobility with Avicenian arguments, not only to give a scientific patent to the question, but also pushing to the social extremes the medical arguments of his contemporary Taddeo, in an intricate web of relations in which all the voices are responding to each other. For the question of why, then, the dialogues are much more relevant than the single voices indeed. Thank you so much for your time.